the cold steel of a suppressed Glock pressed hard against the back of Penelope's neck in the dimly lit, echoing parking garage. Two ruthless syndicate hitmen had her dead to rights, cruel smiles on their faces as they mocked her trembling, soft frame. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fatal crack. But the gunshot that tore through the silence didn't pierce her skull. Instead, her attacker crumpled to the concrete. Stepping out from the shadows, wiping fresh blood from his knuckles, was Arthur Gallagher, the most feared crime boss in Chicago. And he was absolutely furious. The Aon Center stood like a monolith against the freezing, wind-whipped Chicago night, its towering glass facade reflecting the city's scattered amber lights. On the 64th floor, the offices of Apex Worldwide Logistics were swallowed in shadows, save for a single desk lamp burning a hole in the darkness. Penelope Hayes stared intently at her dual monitors, the harsh blue light reflecting in her dark, focused eyes. At 29, Penelope was the executive assistant to the CEO, and she was the undisputed backbone of the company. She was also fat. In the cutthroat, hyper-polished corporate culture of downtown Chicago, where executive suites were usually populated by size 2 women in rigid pencil skirts, Penelope was an anomaly. She wore her size 22 frame with a quiet, dignified confidence, dressing in impeccably tailored Marina Rinaldi blazers and flowing slacks. She knew the whispers that echoed in the break room, the subtle sneers from the board members, and the patronizing glances from visiting executives. But none of that mattered, because she answered to only one man: Arthur Gallagher. Arthur was a phantom in the corporate world. Officially, he was a self-made logistics magnate, a man who moved freight from the port of Baltimore to the tarmac of O'Hare International Airport with unparalleled efficiency. Unofficially, there were whispers, dark, terrifying rumors that Apex Logistics was merely the clean, corporate face of something much older and infinitely more violent. Penelope had spent 3 years turning a blind eye to the cash-heavy accounts, the men with broken noses who occasionally visited the corner office, and the late-night meetings that left the boardroom smelling of imported cigars and metallic tension. She was paid a staggering salary to organize his life, manage his schedules, and never ask questions. But tonight, the numbers on her screen were screaming at her. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Penelope had stayed late to reconcile the Q3 shipping manifests for a major automotive parts contract. She rubbed her tired eyes, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses, and clicked into a restricted subfolder that had been mistakenly left unencrypted on the internal server. She cross-referenced the weights of the shipping containers arriving from Montreal. The math was entirely wrong. Auto parts didn't weigh this much, nor did they require the specialized, climate-controlled, lead-lined transport crates listed on the secondary manifest. Her heart began to hammer a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dug deeper, her fingers flying across the keyboard, bypassing a rudimentary firewall. The itemized list loaded. They weren't auto parts. They were military-grade firearms. Crates of modified FN SCAR assault rifles, crates of C4 explosives, and millions of rounds of untraceable ammunition. Penelope froze, the air suddenly feeling too thin in the expansive office. This wasn't a clerical error. This was an armory. And worse, the routing numbers didn't belong to Arthur's regular distribution channels. They belonged to a shell company owned by the French-Canadian syndicate based out of Quebec, a brutal organization led by a man named Sébastien Laurent. Someone inside Apex was hijacking Arthur's supply lines to smuggle weapons for a rival mob. "Oh, God," Penelope whispered into the empty room. Her soft, trembling hand reached for her mouse. She knew she had to show this to Arthur, but doing so meant acknowledging the reality of who and what he was. She pulled a Kingston encrypted flash drive from her desk drawer, slammed it into the USB port, and began copying the files. The progress bar crawled, 10%, 20%. The silence of the 64th floor was suddenly broken by the distinct ding of the executive elevator down the hall. Penelope's blood turned to ice. Security never patrolled this floor past 10, and Arthur was supposed to be at a black tie gala at the Drake Hotel. She quickly minimized the transfer window and listened. Heavy, deliberate footsteps padded against the plush carpet. It wasn't one set of footsteps. It was two. The tread was too heavy, too synchronized. They were walking methodically down the corridor, checking the doors. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized her. She looked at the progress bar. 85%. "Check the corner office." A low, gravelly voice echoed from the hallway. It wasn't Arthur. Penelope popped the flash drive out the second it hit 100%, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the tiny piece of metal. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her wool cardigan, grabbed her leather tote bag, and killed the desk lamp. Plunged into darkness, she held her breath, pressing her large frame against the wall behind her mahogany desk. "Someone was just here," the second voice said, closer now. The beam of a tactical flashlight swept across the frosted glass of her office door. "Computers are warm." Penelope didn't wait. Slipping off her sensible leather flats to mute her footsteps, she crept toward the secondary exit, a heavy fire door that led to the emergency stairwell. Her heart pounded furiously, the adrenaline masking the physical exertion as she pushed the heavy metal door open, just enough to squeeze her body through. The latch clicked shut behind her, echoing slightly in the concrete cavern of the stairwell. She didn't stop to put her shoes back on. Carrying them in one hand, clutching her bag with the other, she began a frantic descent. She wouldn't take the stairs all the way down. That would take too long and destroy her knees. She just needed to get to the 60th floor and catch the freight elevator straight down to the underground parking garage. "Just get to the car, Penny," she told herself, taking the concrete steps as fast as her legs could carry her. Get to the car, lock the doors, and call Arthur. The freight elevator lurched to a halt at level P4, the deepest, most isolated section of the Aeon Center's subterranean parking structure. The metal doors groaned open, revealing a vast, cavernous expanse of concrete illuminated by flickering, institutional fluorescent lights. The air down here was frigid, smelling strongly of exhaust, damp earth, and ozone. Penelope stepped out, finally dropping her flats to the floor and shoving her swollen, aching feet into them. She was breathing heavily, sweat dampening the collar of her silk blouse beneath her heavy cardigan. Her sensible navy Honda CR-V was parked about 50 yards away, sitting alone under a halo of yellow light. It looked like a sanctuary. She gripped her car keys, the metal digging painfully into her palm as she power-walked across the echoing concrete. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on her terrified mind. She hit the unlock button on her fob. The Honda's headlights flashed cheerfully in the gloom. She was 10 feet away when the screech of tires tore through the silence. A matte black Cadillac Escalade, headlights completely extinguished, accelerated from behind a concrete pillar and slammed on its brakes, completely blocking her Honda. The aggressive smell of burning rubber filled the air. Penelope stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She stumbled backward, her instinct screaming at her to run, but the sheer size of the garage and her own physical limitations mocked the idea. Where would she go? She couldn't outrun a vehicle, and the elevator was already ascending back to the lobby. The doors of the escalade swung open simultaneously. 2 men stepped out. They wore dark tactical jackets and possessed the kind of rugged, scarred faces that belonged in back-alley brawls, not corporate high-rises. They were Mitchell and Bradley, though Penelope didn't know their names. She only knew they represented death. "Going somewhere in a hurry, sweetheart?" Bradley asked, his voice dripping with a cruel, mocking amusement. He leaned against the hood of the Escalade, casually drawing a matte black Glock 19 from his shoulder holster. "Please!" Penelope gasped, clutching her tote bag to her chest like a shield. "I don't have anything. Let me just get in my car." Mitchell chuckled, slowly circling around her right flank to cut off her only avenue of escape. "We know what you downloaded upstairs, Miss Hayes. The boss is very interested in those manifests, and he's very interested in why a fat, glorified secretary is sticking her nose in cartel business." The insult stung, a familiar barb meant to humiliate her, to make her feel small despite her size, to remind her she was soft in a world of hard edges. Penelope swallowed hard, trying to project a defiance she didn't feel. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do," Bradley sneered, stepping closer. The menacing aura of the 2 men was suffocating. "Hand over the drive. Make it easy. A big girl like you isn't going to outrun us, and you're certainly not going to fight us off. Give it up, and maybe we just put a bullet in your head instead of taking you for a ride. The boys back in Quebec love playing with their food." Penelope backed up until her spine hit the cold, rough concrete of a structural pillar. She was trapped. Her hand slipped into her cardigan pocket, her fingers brushing the plastic casing of the Kingston Drive. She thought of Arthur. She thought of the empire he had built, and the ruthless efficiency with which he protected his own. But Arthur wasn't here. "I said, give it to me," Bradley barked, his patience instantly vanishing. He lunged forward, his heavy hand closing around her throat. Penelope let out a strangled cry as he slammed her back against the concrete. The impact knocked the wind out of her, pain radiating down her spine. Bradley pressed the cold steel of the Glock's suppressor hard against the back of her neck, right at the base of her skull. The metallic smell of gun oil mixed with his cheap cologne. "Search her," Bradley ordered Mitchell. Tears of pure terror spilled over Penelope's eyelashes. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling violently under the hitman's grip. "This is it," she thought. "This is how I die. In a cold garage, degraded and alone." But the fatal gunshot didn't come. Instead, there was a sickening crack, the unmistakable sound of bone shattering on impact. Penelope felt the pressure on her throat vanish instantly. She slumped forward, gasping for air, clutching her bruised neck. She forced her eyes open, blinking through her tears. Mitchell was on the ground, his jaw grotesquely dislocated, blood pooling beneath his head. Standing over him, moving with the terrifying, predatory grace of an apex predator, was Arthur Gallagher. Arthur. He was still wearing his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo from the gala, but the bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his thick neck. His piercing grey eyes were black with murderous rage. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked exactly like the mob boss the rumors claimed he was. Bradley spun around, raising his Glock, but he was entirely too slow. Arthur moved with explosive violence, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. He grabbed the slide of Bradley's gun, forcing it downward as it discharged a muffled round into the concrete floor. In the same fluid motion, Arthur drove a brutal, devastating knee into Bradley's abdomen, followed by a crushing elbow strike to the hitman's temple. Bradley collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, landing in a heap next to the Escalade. The garage fell dead silent again, save for the ragged sound of Penelope's hyperventilation. Arthur stood, panting slightly, his massive chest heaving beneath his crisp white shirt. He looked down at his bloody knuckles, then slowly turned his gaze to Penelope. The terrifying rage in his eyes instantly melted, replaced by a profound, desperate relief. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame dwarfing her. For 3 years, they had maintained strict professional boundaries. But right now, Arthur reached out, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face. "Penny," Arthur breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Are you hurt? Did they break your skin?" "I have the drive," Penelope sobbed, pulling the flash drive from her pocket, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "They were hijacking your shipments, Arthur. They were going to kill me." Arthur didn't even look at the multi-million-dollar data drive. He looked only at her, taking in her tear-stained cheeks, the red marks forming on her throat, the way her soft body trembled against the concrete pillar. He stepped closer, stepping deliberately over the bleeding hitman, and pulled Penelope against his broad chest, shielding her entirely from the violence around them. "Keep the drive," Arthur murmured fiercely into her hair, his arms wrapping tight and protective around her large frame, making her feel incredibly safe, incredibly small. "No one is ever going to touch you again, Penny. I swear to God I'm going to burn their entire syndicate to ashes for even looking at you." Arthur did not let go of Penelope until the violent tremors racking her heavy frame began to subside. He held her with a terrifying, absolute possessiveness, his large hand gently pressing the back of her head against his chest. The smell of his Tom Ford cologne mingled with the metallic scent of fresh blood from his knuckles. Around them, the sprawling underground garage of the Aeon Center remained dead quiet, the 2 unconscious hitmen bleeding out onto the cold concrete. With one arm still wrapped securely around her waist, Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his tuxedo jacket and withdrew a heavily encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a single digit. "Declan," Arthur's voice was remarkably calm, a chilling contrast to the brutal violence he had just unleashed. "Level P4. Bring the cleaning crew. I have 2 of Laurent's attack dogs down here. They're breathing, but just barely. Secure the perimeter, scrub the security feeds, and send the Maybach." He hung up without waiting for a reply, turning his full attention back to Penelope. She was pale, her usually warm, expressive face locked in a mask of sheer shock. Her sensible navy cardigan was rumpled, and she was clutching her leather tote bag like a physical shield. "Come with me," Arthur commanded softly, his hand slipping down to firmly interlock with hers. Within minutes, a slate-gray, heavily armored Mercedes Maybach S680 Guard descended the concrete ramp, its tires whispering against the pavement. The rear doors unlocked automatically. Arthur guided her into the cavernous, leather-lined interior, shielding her head with his hand before sliding in beside her. The thick, ballistic glass sealed them off from the brutal reality of the garage. The drive to Arthur's private residence was a blur for Penelope. They navigated through the neon-drenched streets of downtown Chicago, heading north toward the Gold Coast. The silence in the back of the Maybach was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken truth that had just irrevocably altered their lives. Penelope stared down at her lap, her fingers mindlessly smoothing the fabric of her plus-size slacks. She was a woman who prided herself on logic, on organization, on keeping the chaotic world of apex logistics running in perfectly straight lines. Now, Those lines were painted in blood. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice raspy and raw from where Bradley's hand had crushed her windpipe. Arthur looked down at his knuckles. The skin was split, the blood already drying into dark crimson flakes. "It's not my blood, Penny." The Maybach pulled into a private subterranean entrance of an ultra-exclusive high-rise on Astor Street. Heavily armed security personnel in tailored suits nodded as the vehicle passed. Arthur led her up a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, two-story penthouse. The walls were clad in dark walnut, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding, godlike view of the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. "Sit," Arthur instructed, guiding her to a massive, curved velvet sofa in the center of the living room. Penelope sank into the plush cushions, her exhausted body feeling impossibly heavy. She watched as Arthur walked over to a wet bar, shedding his ruined tuxedo jacket and tossing it carelessly over a bespoke leather chair. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his white dress shirt, rolling them up to his elbows to reveal thick, corded forearms covered in faded, intricate ink, tattoos that did not belong to a corporate CEO, but to a man forged in the fires of organized crime. He returned a moment later with a glass of water and a cold compress wrapped in a clean linen towel. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, Arthur knelt on the Persian rug right in front of her, disregarding the sharp crease of his expensive trousers. He gently tilted her chin upward, his grey eyes narrowing dangerously as he inspected the purpling bruises forming a violent necklace across her pale throat. "He put his hands on you," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping to a lethal, gravelly octave. The pure hatred in his tone wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the ghost of the man who had dared to touch her. He pressed the cold compress gently against her skin. "I should have killed him in the garage." Penelope winced at the cold, but leaned into his touch, her heart performing a frantic, chaotic rhythm. "You saved my life, Arthur. But what happens now? The files on that Kingston drive. The files prove that someone inside my inner circle is running weapons for the French Canadians," Arthur interrupted, his thumb gently stroking the unbruised skin of her jawline. "But that is my problem to solve. Your only job tonight is to breathe." "They called me a fat, glorified secretary," Penelope blurted out, the humiliation of the garage suddenly bubbling to the surface, breaking her professional facade. A fresh tear slipped down her cheek. "They thought I was easy prey, because of how I look, because I'm soft." Arthur's hand froze. He set the cold compress down on the glass coffee table and shifted closer, invading her personal space entirely. His large hands gripped her thighs, grounding her, his touch searing through her slacks. "Listen to me very carefully," Arthur said, his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding sincerity. "There is not a single flaw on you. Your softness is the only beautiful thing in my entire God-forsaken world. They didn't target you because you were easy prey, Penny. They targeted you because you are the smartest person in my empire, and you caught them. You outsmarted a cartel of hardened killers with nothing but a keyboard and your brilliant, beautiful mind." He leaned in, his lips hovering mere inches from hers, the heat of his breath washing over her trembling mouth. "And if anyone ever disrespects you again, I will cut out their tongue. Do you understand me?" The encrypted files from Penelope's Kingston Drive were fully decoded by 3 a.m. Arthur's penthouse had been transformed into a military command center. 4 of his top lieutenants, massive men wearing shoulder holsters over expensive sweaters, moved silently through the grand space. Declan, Arthur's terrifyingly calm second-in-command, stood by the mahogany dining table, tapping away at a customized, heavily encrypted Panasonic toughbook. Penelope sat wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket on the velvet sofa, a mug of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. She should have been asleep in the guest wing, but she refused to leave. She needed to see this through. Arthur had allowed her to stay, though he positioned his own massive frame between her and the front door, a constant, physical barrier of protection. "Boss?" Declan spoke up, his thick Irish accent cutting through the tense silence of the room. "The routing numbers trace back to a Cayman's offshore account. I cross-referenced the digital signatures on the false manifests. They were authorized using top-tier executive credentials." Arthur poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan 25, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Whose credentials, Declan?" "Harrison Cole," Declan replied flatly. "VP of Operations." Penelope gasped. Harrison Cole was a golden boy, tall, impeccably groomed, with a Harvard MBA and a condescending smirk he reserved specifically for Penelope whenever she requested his quarterly reports. He had been with Apex Logistics for 5 years. "Bring him here," Arthur ordered, taking a slow sip of the scotch. "Now." It took less than 45 minutes. The private elevator chimed at 3:50 a.m., and 2 of Arthur's men dragged a thrashing, disheveled Harrison Cole into the penthouse. He was wearing silk pajamas and an expensive Patek Philippe watch, his face pale with sudden, terrifying realization. They threw him onto the hardwood floor in the center of the living room. "Arthur, what the hell is this?" Harrison sputtered, scrambling to his knees. "Your gorillas just broke down my door." Arthur didn't raise his voice. He simply walked over to the dining table, picked up the printed manifest, and let the heavy sheets of paper flutter down onto Harrison's lap. Harrison looked down at the documents, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room, taking in the armed men, the grim faces, and finally, Penelope, sitting quietly on the sofa wrapped in cashmere. "You're running FN scars and C4 through my Montreal routes for Sébastien Laurent," Arthur stated, his voice a low, lethal hum. "You're using my clean trucks to supply my deadliest enemy. How much did Laurent pay you to betray me, Harrison?" "It's a mistake," Harrison stammered, his polished corporate persona shattering into pathetic desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at Penelope. "It was her. The fat cow must have manipulated the logs. She's always hated me, Arthur. You know she's incompetent. Look at her. She can barely fit behind her desk. You think she understands encrypted logistics." The room went deathly still. Declan closed his laptop. The armed guards subtly shifted their weight, stepping back. They all knew what was about to happen. Penelope flinched at the insult, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But before the sting of the words could truly register, Arthur moved. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. Arthur crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his heavy leather shoe kicking Harrison squarely in the chest, sending the executive crashing flat onto his back. Before Harrison could even gasp for air, Arthur's heavy boot came down squarely on Harrison's right hand, pinning it to the hardwood. Harrison screamed in agony, thrashing helplessly against the crushing weight. "You will never speak to her again," Arthur whispered, pulling a sleek, dark titanium karambit blade from his waistband. The curved blade caught the dim light of the penthouse. "You will never look at her again, and you will certainly never insult the woman who is going to be sitting by my side when I take apart Laurent's empire piece by piece." Penelope's breath caught. Sitting by his side, Arthur crouched down, pressing the tip of the curved blade against Harrison's cheekbone. Sebastien Laurent has a drop point for these weapons. Where is it? I don't know, Harrison sobbed, tears and snot running down his face. He uses a proxy. Arthur applied a fraction of an inch of pressure. A thin line of crimson appeared on Harrison's cheek. I will ask you one more time, Harrison. Where is Laurent keeping the C4? The old meatpacking plant in Fulton Market, Harrison shrieked, instantly breaking. The abandoned one on Kinsey. The shipment arrived yesterday. Laurent is moving the guns out tomorrow night. Please, Arthur, please. Arthur stood up smoothly, wiping the tiny drop of blood off his blade with a silk pocket square before sliding it back into its sheath. He looked at Declan. Take him to the basement. I'll deal with him when I get back. Where are we going, boss? Declan asked, signaling the guards to drag the weeping executive toward the service elevator. Arthur turned, his eyes locking onto Penelope. The violent mob boss vanished, replaced instantly by the fiercely protective man who had held her in the garage. He walked over to the sofa, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. We are going to war, Arthur said softly, his thumb tracing her cheek. Declan and the boys will stay here to guard you. No one gets on this floor. I am going to burn Sebastien Laurent's armory to the ground. Penelope reached out, her soft, warm hand wrapping around Arthur's thick, tattooed wrist. Come back to me, she whispered, the truth of her own heart finally laid bare in the chaotic aftermath of the night. Arthur's eyes darkened with raw, unbridled devotion. Try and stop me. The Fulton Market District, once a gritty expanse of meatpacking facilities and cold storage warehouses, had largely been gentrified into Michelin-starred restaurants and trendy lofts. But on the desolate western edge of Kinsey Street, a massive, rusted, windowless structure remained untouched by the city's modernization. It was officially registered to a defunct agricultural holding company. Tonight, it was Sebastien Laurent's staging ground. Arthur's convoy of 3 matte black Chevy Suburbans rolled to a silent halt a block away, their heavy tires cutting through the icy, freezing rain that had begun to punish Chicago. Arthur stepped out of the lead vehicle, the freezing wind whipping the collar of his tactical overcoat. He had traded his ruined Tom Ford tuxedo for a black Kevlar vest, reinforced combat boots, and a customized Daniel Defense Mk-18 suppressed rifle slung securely across his broad chest. Beside him, 4 of his most lethal enforcers fanned out. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized precision of apex predators, communicating through subtle hand signals. Arthur raised 2 fingers, and the team breached the perimeter fence, clipping the heavy iron chains with hydraulic cutters. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, motor oil, and the unmistakable sharp chemical scent of raw C4 explosives. 24 of Laurent's men were actively loading the stolen military crates into nondescript commercial moving trucks. They were heavily armed, confident, and completely unaware that death had just walked through their front door. Arthur didn't offer a warning. He didn't negotiate. He raised his Mk-18 and squeezed the trigger. The suppressed muzzle flashes strobed violently in the dim, cavernous space. Arthur dropped the 2 men guarding the loading dock before they even registered the threat. Chaos erupted. Shouts in frantic French-Canadian echoed off the corrugated steel ceiling as Laurent's syndicate scrambled for cover, returning wild, undisciplined fire. Arthur moved through the warehouse like a force of nature. He was a massive target, but his tactical brilliance and sheer, terrifying aggression overwhelmed the opposition. He flanked a group of 3 men pinned behind a forklift, switching to his Glock 19 and dropping them with surgical, devastating accuracy. He was not just clearing a room. He was exorcising the burning rage that had ignited the moment Bradley put a gun to Penelope's neck. Within 12 minutes, the gunfire ceased. The warehouse was a graveyard of shattered crates, groaning men, and pools of dark blood reflecting the harsh security lights. Arthur kicked a discarded assault rifle away from a bleeding syndicate lieutenant and grabbed him by the tactical vest, hauling him up against a concrete pillar. "Where is Sebastian?" Arthur roared, the sound echoing like thunder. The man spat a glob of blood onto Arthur's boot, grinning with broken teeth. "You're too late, Gallagher. The boss isn't here. He knew you'd trace the routing numbers eventually. This was just a distraction." Arthur's blood ran cold. The adrenaline spike morphed instantly into a suffocating, icy dread. He dropped the man, his mind racing through the logistics. If this was a distraction, where was the main event? Suddenly, a burner phone resting on a nearby stack of C4 crates began to vibrate, playing a tinny, generic ringtone. Arthur snatched it up, pressing it to his ear without saying a word. "Arthur," the smooth, heavily accented voice of Sebastian Laurel purred through the receiver. "I see my men kept you busy. You brought your entire heavy response team to Kinsey Street. Very impressive. But tell me, my friend, who is watching the penthouse?" Arthur crushed the phone in his massive fist, the plastic casing shattering into pieces. "Burn it all!" he barked at his men, sprinting back toward the Suburbans. "Set the timers on the C4 for 3 minutes and burn this place to the ground. We have to get back to Astor Street." Meanwhile, high above the city in the impenetrable sanctuary of the Astor Street penthouse, Penelope was completely unaware of the impending storm. The adrenaline from the parking garage had finally crashed, leaving her utterly exhausted but completely unable to sleep. She sat in the sprawling, dimly lit library of Arthur's master suite. Declan and 2 guards were stationed downstairs, securing the perimeter, leaving her in total isolation on the 2nd floor. Seeking a distraction from her racing thoughts, Penelope walked over to Arthur's massive antique oak desk. In his haste to arm himself, Arthur had left the bottom drawer slightly ajar. Penelope wasn't a snoop, but the red, highly classified file folder peeking out caught her eye. It didn't have a corporate Apex Logistics logo on it. It had her name, Hayes P. Frowning, Penelope gently pulled the heavy file onto the desk and opened it under the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a background check. It was a terrifyingly thorough chronicle of absolute devotion. There were documents detailing the anonymous, multi-million-dollar buyout of her mother's crushing medical debt 3 years ago, routed through a shell charity called the Horizon Trust. There were surveillance photos of a man who had briefly stalked Penelope a year ago. The final photo showed the man boarding a one-way flight to Anchorage, Alaska, looking absolutely terrified, his bank accounts suspiciously zeroed out. But the most shocking document was an internal HR termination file for Gregory Pratt, a former Apex vice president. The official company line was that Gregory had embezzled funds. But Arthur's private notes, written in his sharp, aggressive handwriting, told the truth. Pratt made a disparaging remark regarding Penelope's weight in the boardroom. Embezzlement framed. Ruin his career. No one disrespects my queen. Penelope covered her mouth with her trembling, soft hand, tears welling in her eyes. For 3 years, she had believed she was just a highly efficient assistant to a cold, untouchable billionaire. She had worried about her size, about fitting into a world of sharp edges and superficial perfection. But Arthur hadn't just accepted her. He had secretly built a fortress around her. He had been quietly, obsessively in love with her from the very beginning. The profound, earth-shattering realization was suddenly shattered by the muffled, terrifying sound of automatic gunfire erupting from the floor below. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse library shuddered as the concussive echo of a shotgun blast ripped through the lower level. Penelope froze, the classified file slipping from her fingers and scattering across Arthur's desk. The illusion of safety vanished in an instant. Downstairs, chaos had descended upon the Astor Street residence. Sébastien Laurent hadn't sent street-level thugs. He had hired a specialized extraction team, heavily armed mercenaries who had bypassed the building's biometric security by compromising the head concierge. They had come up through the dedicated service elevator, catching Declan's perimeter guards in a devastating crossfire. "Penelope! The panic room!" Declan's voice roared over the intercom system, strained and breathless. The sound of shattered glass and relentless suppressing fire drowned out the end of his sentence. Panic, raw and blinding, seized Penelope's chest. She wasn't a soldier. She was an executive assistant. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her breathing shallow and ragged. She looked down at her soft, full figure in the mirror of the hallway. She wasn't built for running, and she certainly wasn't built for a gunfight. But she remembered the file on the desk. She remembered Arthur's calloused hands framing her face in the parking garage. He was coming back for her. She just had to survive until he did. Kicking off her uncomfortable flats, Penelope sprinted deeper into the master suite, her bare feet slapping quietly against the Brazilian cherry hardwood. Her lungs burned with the sudden exertion, her heavy thighs aching as she pushed her body to its absolute limit. She reached the expansive walk-in closet, shoving aside rows of Arthur's bespoke suits until she found the false wall panel at the back. She slammed her palm against the hidden biometric scanner. A green laser swept over her fingerprints. Arthur had secretly coded her into the system months ago. The heavy, steel-reinforced door hissed open with a pneumatic release. Penelope threw her body inside the cramped, reinforced steel cube just as heavy, thudding footsteps breached the second-floor landing. She slammed her hand onto the emergency lock button. The thick vault door slammed shut, the locking bolts sliding into place with a deafening metallic clang, sealing her in absolute darkness for a split second before the red emergency lights flickered on. She collapsed back against the cold steel wall, gasping for air, clutching her chest as her heart threatened to beat its way out of her rib cage. "She's in the vault!" A muffled, heavily accented voice shouted from the bedroom outside. It was Jean-Luc, Laurent's sadistic chief enforcer. "Bring up the thermal thermite charges. We burn through the hinges." Inside the panic room, Penelope scrambled to the communications console. Her fingers, though trembling, flew across the illuminated keyboard with the same lightning speed she used to manage Apex's global logistics. She brought up the penthouse security feeds on the internal monitors. The screen flickered to life. Declan was pinned down behind the marble kitchen island downstairs, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his shoulder, exchanging fire with 3 mercenaries. In the master bedroom, she saw Jean-Luc and another heavily armed man attaching thick blocks of incendiary thermite to the seams of the panic room door. If they ignite that, it will melt the locking mechanism in 2 minutes, Penelope thought, her mind racing. The sheer terror threatened to paralyze her, but her brilliant, logical brain refused to shut down. She looked at the environmental controls on the panic room console. Arthur had wired the penthouse to a localized, commercial-grade halon fire suppression system to protect his priceless art collection and secure servers. The gas was designed to rapidly extinguish flames by chemically reacting with oxygen, effectively sucking the breathable air out of a sealed room within seconds. Penelope didn't hesitate. She toggled the master bedroom's HVAC vents to the closed position, sealing the room from the rest of the penthouse, and slammed her fist onto the manual halon override button. On the security monitor, Jean-Luc raised a blowtorch to ignite the thermite. Before the flame could touch the fuse, the ceiling vents in the bedroom violently expelled thick, white clouds of heavy halon gas. The mercenaries dropped the torch, instantly clutching their throats. The gas displaced the oxygen at a terrifying rate. Jean-Luc stumbled blindly, slamming his fists against the reinforced glass of the bedroom windows, desperate for air. But the ballistic glass held firm. Within 45 seconds, both men collapsed onto the hardwood floor, suffocating in the sterile, white fog. Penelope watched the screen, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking violently as she realized what she had just done to survive. 5 minutes later, the main doors of the penthouse downstairs exploded inward. Arthur Gallagher tore into his own home like a vengeful god of war. He didn't bother checking corners. He moved with blind, terrifying fury. The remaining mercenaries in the living room barely had time to turn their weapons before Arthur neutralized them with devastating close-quarters brutality, stepping over their bodies to reach Declan. "The vault!" Declan gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. They went upstairs. Arthur vaulted up the sweeping staircase, his heart in his throat. He reached the master suite, seeing the residual halon gas slowly dissipating. He stepped over the unconscious bodies of Jean-Luc and the second enforcer, ripping the thermite charges off the vault door with his bare hands. He slammed his thumb onto the biometric scanner. The heavy door hissed and swung open. Penelope was huddled in the corner of the small steel room, her knees pulled to her chest, trembling uncontrollably. Arthur dropped his Mk-18 rifle. It clattered against the floor, forgotten. He fell to his knees inside the panic room, his massive frame completely enveloping her as he pulled her fiercely into his chest. "Penny," Arthur breathed, his voice breaking, burying his face into her hair. "God, I thought I lost you. I thought I was too late." Penelope sobbed, wrapping her arms tightly around his thick neck, inhaling the scent of smoke, rain, and his cologne. She felt the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart against her own. "I read the files, Arthur," she whispered against his chest, her voice raw. "I saw what you did for me. All of it." Arthur pulled back slightly, his grey eyes locked onto hers, burning with intense, unapologetic vulnerability. "I would burn the entire world to the ground to keep you safe," he vowed, his hands gently framing her face. "You are my entire life, Penelope. There is no Apex Logistics without you. There is no me without you." And in the steel cage of the panic room, surrounded by the ruin of his empire, the ruthless Mafia boss finally leaned down and claimed the soft, brilliant woman he had loved in secret for years, sealing her lips with a desperate, crushing kiss. The kiss broke only when they both desperately needed oxygen. Arthur rested his forehead against hers, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that stained her flushed cheeks. The adrenaline of the breach was fading, leaving a heavy, exhausted reality in its wake. But Penelope's mind, the brilliant, analytical engine that ran Arthur's entire logistical empire, was already snapping back into sharp focus. She gently pushed against his solid, Kevlar-clad chest. "Arthur," she breathed, her dark eyes wide but remarkably clear. "Laurent is still out there. If he realizes the assassination squad failed, he will vanish. We will never be safe." Arthur's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek as the ruthless syndicate boss re-emerged. "I will hunt him to the ends of the earth, Penny. He signed his own death warrant the moment his men put a hand on you in that garage." "You don't have to hunt him," Penelope said, her voice steadying as she stepped out of the reinforced steel vault. She deliberately ignored the suffocated mercenaries lying on the hardwood floor, stepping over them in her bare feet. She walked straight to the antique oak desk, where her laptop sat beside the scattered files of Arthur's obsessive devotion. Arthur followed her, his eyes locked on her soft, determined profile in absolute awe. Penelope's fingers flew across the keyboard. When Harrison confessed to the Fulton Market warehouse, he was telling the truth about the C4, but Sebastien Laurent is entirely too arrogant to wait in a dirty meat-packing plant. He wouldn't leave his extraction to chance. Look at the secondary refuel routing codes on the offshore Cayman manifests. She brought up a complex web of numerical data, highlighting a specific string of digits in bright yellow. "This is an aviation fuel requisition," Penelope explained, her brilliant mind connecting the invisible dots of the criminal underworld. "It was authorized 12 hours ago under a dummy corporation. They didn't route it to O'Hare or Midway. They routed it to Chicago Executive Airport in Wheeling, Private Hangar 4. He has a jet fueled and waiting. He's leaving the country right now." Arthur stared at the screen, then looked down at Penelope. The profound reverence in his grey eyes was overwhelming. He leaned down, pressing a hard, fervent kiss to the top of her head. "You are an absolute godsend," he murmured. He keyed his tactical radio. "Declan, bandage that shoulder. Call the cleanup crews for the penthouse, then assemble the strike team. We are going to Wheeling." 40 minutes later, the freezing rain had turned into a torrential downpour as Arthur's armored Suburbans smashed through the chain-link security gates of Chicago Executive Airport. Inside Hangar 4, a sleek white Gulfstream G650 sat on the polished concrete, its turbines already beginning to whine as they spooled up for takeoff. Sebastien Laurent, a sharply dressed, arrogant man in a bespoke charcoal suit, was walking up the boarding stairs, flanked by 4 heavily armed bodyguards. They never made it to the cabin. Arthur's convoy skidded to a halt inside the hangar, blocking the hangar doors. Before the vehicles even fully stopped, Arthur and his men were out, their suppressed rifles raised. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. Arthur's enforcers neutralized Laurent's bodyguards with terrifying, synchronized precision, dropping them to the tarmac in a matter of seconds. Laurent froze on the aluminum stairs, the arrogant smirk completely vanishing from his face as he stared down the barrel of Arthur Gallagher's Mk-18. Arthur slowly walked toward the jet, the rain dripping from his broad shoulders. He slung the rifle onto his back and drew his Glock 19, his eyes black with murderous intent. "Arthur," Laurent stammered, raising his hands, his thick French-Canadian accent wavering with sheer panic. "Wait, we can negotiate. The shipping routes, the guns, take it all, it's just business." "It was just business," Arthur rumbled, his voice echoing over the high-pitched whine of the jet engines, "until you sent your dogs to a parking garage to put a gun to my woman's head." Laurent's eyes widened in horror as he realized the fatal miscalculation he had made. He hadn't just attacked a rival boss's logistics network. He had threatened the only thing Arthur Gallagher actually cared about. "She was just a secretary," Laurent shouted desperately. "She is a queen," Arthur corrected coldly. He raised the Glock and fired a single, deafening shot. Sebastien Laurent collapsed violently onto the aluminum stairs, his criminal empire dying with him on the cold tarmac of Chicago. Arthur didn't even watch the body fall. He turned his back, holstered his weapon, and walked back to the Maybach. By the time Arthur returned to the Astor Street penthouse, dawn was breaking over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in soft hues of violet and gold. The bodies had been cleared, the shattered glass swept away, and the ruined doors secured by Declan's men. Arthur found Penelope in the master bedroom. She had showered, washing away the smoke and the terror of the night, and was wearing one of Arthur's oversized white dress shirts. It draped beautifully over her full, luscious curves, stopping mid-thigh. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise. Arthur unstrapped his Kevlar vest, letting it drop to the floor along with his weapons. He was exhausted, battered, and covered in the ashes of his enemies, but as he looked at her, he had never felt more alive. He walked up behind her, wrapping his thick, heavily tattooed arms around her soft waist, pulling her flush against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of her skin. Penelope leaned back into his solid embrace, her hands resting over his thick forearms. "Is it done?" she whispered. "It's done," Arthur murmured, his lips brushing against her collarbone. "Laurent is gone. The syndicate is broken. You are perfectly safe." He gently turned her around in his arms, his rough hands sliding down to grip her wide hips with absolute reverence. He looked at her soft, beautiful face, tracing the curve of her cheek with his thumb. "I spent 3 years watching you run my world from the shadows," Arthur said, his voice thick with raw emotion. "I watched men underestimate you. I watched you carry the weight of an empire on those beautiful shoulders. You are never hiding in the background again, Penelope. You aren't my assistant anymore. You are my partner. You are my equal. You are everything." Penelope smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that illuminated the room. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, pulling his face down to hers. "Then we have a lot of corporate restructuring to do, Mr. Gallagher." Arthur let out a low, breathless laugh, capturing her lips in a deep, sweeping kiss as the morning light flooded the penthouse. The corporate world thought she was just a plus-size secretary, but the underworld now knew the terrifying truth. Penelope Hayes was the undisputed queen of Chicago, and the most dangerous man in the city existed only to worship her. And that concludes the intense, blood-soaked romance of Arthur and Penelope. From a terrifying encounter in a cold parking garage to ruling the Chicago underworld side by side, Penelope proved that her brilliant mind and soft curves were the absolute ultimate power in Arthur's brutal empire. Nobody messes with the Mafia boss's queen. If you loved this thrilling story of loyalty, explosive revenge, and undeniable romance, please make sure to smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story.